Here we are in the 5th week, reading the first chapter of the 5th book on Canaan's side. It's been quite instructive in some way, reading from these books in such a compressed piece of time, because all around it is also the sense of the 27 years I actually spent in making the 8 books. We're here, I'm counting my blessings. We have a beautiful day here in Wicklow. The rooks are keeping their New York Hell's Kitchen going in the beech trees there. And I have my son Toby again to do the recording and the visual for this reading, which is a great boon to me. Lilly Bere, and her married name, is at some degree, as usual, based on a great aunt. As a little boy, I only saw her once when she was back from America. And I remember her outside our house in Monkstown. I don't remember her coming into the house, but I remember her pretty American summer dress. And I remember being particularly struck by her liveliness and happiness and dancingness. She must have been in her 50s or 60s at that time. She never appeared again in my memory, even. And I don't think she ever did come back. She had been... The book is different to the real person, of course, because I didn't really know anything about her beyond that, and that she worked in Dublin Castle as a young woman because her father was the chief superintendent there. I do know, and I can't remember if I found this out before or after writing the book, but her brother, my great uncle, got into big trouble with Michael Collins and had to flee from Ireland and was in Chicago working as an engineer, which is his work. And his family were told that he had died in an accident in a reservoir. That was the official news that came back. But it turned out that, in fact, he'd been hunted down more or less in Chicago, maybe by Clan na Gael or some such, and murdered as he walked along a street in Chicago. That's in this book in a different form. Anyway, this is her. She's quite old, and her grandson Bill has just tragically taken his life, and he's come back from the war in Kuwait. Lots of soldiers in Lilly's world, and he's come back distraught, really. Maybe not obviously distraught, but she knows now, inwardly, very distraught. And she's living in the Hamptons. She works for a woman called Mrs. Wolahan, and who is a rich American woman. And one of Mrs. Wolahan's friends, Mr. Dillinger, pays special attention to Lilly, who cooks for Mrs. Wolahan. And this is the day after the death of her grandson, Bill. First day without Bill. Bill is gone. What is the sound of an 89-year-old heart breaking? It might not be much more than silence, and certainly a small, slight sound. When I was 4, I owned a porcelain doll given me by a strange agency. My mother's sister, who lived down in Wicklow, had kept it from her own childhood and that of her sister, and gave it to me as a sort of keepsake of my mother. At 4, such a doll may be precious for other reasons, not least her beauty. I can still see the painted face, calm and oriental, and the blue silk dress she wore. My father, much to my puzzlement, was worried by such a gift. It troubled him in a way I had no means to understand. He said it was too much for a little girl, even though the same little girl he himself loved with a complete worship. One Sunday, about a year after I was first given it, I insisted on bringing it to Mass with me, despite the long and detailed protestations of my father, who was religious in the sense he hoped there was an afterlife. He bet all his heart on that. Somehow a doll was not a fitting Mass-goer in his estimation. As I carried her in stubbornly to the pro-cathedral in Marlborough Street, by some accident, possibly the great atmosphere there of seriousness, she started to fall from my arms. To this day, I am not certain, not entirely, that I didn't let her go on some peculiar impulse. But if I did, I immediately regretted it. The ground of the cathedral was flagged and hard. Her beautiful dress could not save her, and her perfect face hit the stone and smashed worse than an egg. My heart broke for her in the same instance, so that the sound of her destruction became in my childish memory the sound of my heart breaking. And even though it was a babyish fancy, I do wonder now if it might not be a sound like that an 89-year-old heart makes, coming asunder from grief, a small, slight sound. But the feeling of it is like a landscape engulfed in flood water in the pitch darkness, and everything, hearth and byre, animal and human, terrified and threatened. It is as if someone, some great agency, some CIA of the heavens, knew well the little mechanism that I am and how it is wrapped and fixed, and has the booklet or manual to undo me, and cog by cog and wire by wire is doing so, with no intention ever to put me back together again, and indifferent to the fact that all my pieces are being thrown down and lost. I am so terrified by grief that there is solace in nothing. I carry in my skull a sort of molten sphere instead of a brain, and I am burning there with horror and misery. God forgive me. God help me. I must settle myself. I must. Please, God help me. Do you see me? I am sitting here at my kitchen table with its red formica. The kitchen is gleaming. I have made tea. I scalded the pot even in my distraction. 1 spoon for me and 1 for the pot. I let it brew as always, waited as always. The yellow light in the window facing the sea, as solid looking as an old bronze shield. In my grey dress of heavy linen, that I regretted buying the moment I paid out the money for it in Main Street years ago, and still regret, though it is warm in this struggling weather. I will drink the tea. I will drink the tea. Bill is gone. The legend of my mother was that she died in giving birth to me. I broke free, my father said, like a pheasant from cover, noisily. His own father had been steward of Humewood Estate in Wicklow, so he knew what a pheasant looked like breaking from cover. My mother died just as the need for candlelight failed, at the first instance of the dawn. It was in Dorky village, not far from the sea. For many years, that was just a story to me. But when I was pregnant with my own child, it suddenly became vivid, and as if it was present time. I sensed her in that cramped delivery room in Cleveland as I strained to get him out. I never had any true thought of my mother till then, and yet in those moments I do not think any human being was ever closer to another. When the baby was laid on my breast at last, me panting like an animal, and that matchless happiness surged through me, I cried for her, and the worth and weight of those tears was more to me than a kingdom. When I was shown the Catholic Catechism at 4 in the little infant school attached to the castle, and the very first question was posed, Who made the world? I knew in my heart that the teacher, Mrs. O'Toole, erred in providing the answer, God. She stood before us and read out the question and answer in her wren-sized voice, and I might have been inclined to believe her because she was impressive to me at 4 in her skirt as grey as a seal in Dublin Zoo, and she had been very kind to me as I came in and had given me an apple. But the world, as I thought she ought to have known, was made by my father, James Patrick Dunn, not quite at that time, but later to be Chief Superintendent of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. The legend of my father was that he had led the charge against Larkin's men in Sackville Street. When Larkin came over O'Connell Bridge in a fake beard and moustache and walked up through the marble corridors of the Imperial Hotel and out onto a balcony and began to give a speech to the hundreds of workers gathered below, which had been forbidden by edict, my father and the other officers ordered the waiting constables forward with batons drawn. When I first was told this story as a child, on the very evening it happened, I misunderstood and thought my father had done something heroic. I added in my imagination a white horse, upon which he rode with ceremonial sword drawn. I saw him rush forward like in a proper cavalry charge. I gasped at his chivalry and courage. 'Twas only years later I understood that he had advanced on foot and that 3 of the working men had been killed. Old matters, and not much to do with the grief of the present, except it gives me my bearings. Now I'll draw breath and start properly. When I came back in from the funeral, my friend, Mr. Dillinger, had come into the hallway while I was out and left flowers but not waited for me. They were very costly flowers, and he had put a little note against them and written, "To my dear friend Mrs. Bere, in the time of her great loss." It touched me truly. I am sure if Mr. Nolan was still alive, he also would have crept in, but it would not have been welcome. Maybe if I didn't know what I know now, maybe if Mr. Nolan's death had not occurred when it did, I might have gone on imagining him my closest friend in life. It is so strange that his death and the death of my grandson Bill have happened so close together in time. All things come in threes. No doubt this is true. The third death will be my own. I am 89 years old and will end my life very shortly. How can I live without Bill? I cannot do such a terrible thing without explanation. But who do I explain to? Mr. Dillinger? Mrs. Wolahan? Myself? I cannot depart without some effort to account for this despair. I am not generally despairing, and I hope I have exhibited little enough of it as a living, breathing woman. It has not been my style at all, so I will not entertain it for long now. I feel it so deeply, I fear it troubles my very pancreas, that strange blue organ that has killed Mr. Nolan, but I do not intend to feel it much longer. As long as it takes to speak into the shadows of the past, into the blue ether of the future, so long will it be, I hope and pray. Then I will find some quiet method to dispatch myself. I have not been immune to all the lovely sights of this world that I have been granted, whether some corner of Dublin as a child, some little unprized courtyard in the castle that seemed to me like a dusty paradise, or in these later times those long-limbed creaturely fogs that walk in against the Hamptons like armies, whether attacking or defeated, whether going out or returning home is hard to say. I hope and pray Mr. Nolan wends the long downward road to hell, with the fields beginning to burn about him, and the sunlight to take on a worrying ragged hue, the vistas to alter and seem strange to him. not the wide tobacco fields and blithe wooded hills of home after all, for he was born and raised in Tennessee, despite his Irish name. And like every dying son of a place, he may have imagined himself wending homeward naturally in death. And though in essence I loved him while he was alive, and for many, many years we were friends, it will only be just and right now that the devil takes his hand and leads him in among the smoking meadows. The devil I am beginning to suspect, and great grief it is causing me, has a greater sense of justice than the other man. Only the faithful can be truly faithful. Only the losers can truly win. This was said to me once by my grandson Bill with his usual sparkle before he went to the Desert War. He had already been divorced, aged 19, and already believed himself to have lost in life, or life with a capital L, as he called it. The war took the last sparkle out of him. He returned from the burning desert like a man that had seen one of the devil's miracles. Some mere weeks later, he was out with his friends, maybe doing a little of that drinking he liked. Next day he was found by a cleaner lady in the toilets of his old high school, of all places. He had climbed in there on some impulse known only to himself. He had killed himself on a Saturday night, for the reason, I am sure, that only the janitor would discover him on Sunday, and not the great tide of children on Monday. He had hanged himself on his tie from the door hook. Why am I alive when he is dead? Why did death take him? Nothing else on earth would have set me to writing. I hate writing. I hate pens and paper and all that fussiness. I have done well enough without it too, I think. Oh, I'm lying to myself. I have feared writing, being scarcely able to write my name until I was 8. The nuns in North Great Georgia Street were not kind about that, but books have saved me sometimes, that is the truth. My Samaritans, cookery books when I was learning my trade, years ago, though in these later years I sometimes still find myself dipping back into my tattered White House cookbook right enough to remind myself of some elusive detail. There is no good cook that has not found errors even in their favourite cookbook and marked them in the margins like an old book maybe in the lost Library of Alexandria. I will read the paper on Sunday sometimes in a certain mood, from stem to stern, burn through it like a growing flame. I quite like the Bible in a rarer mood. The Bible is like a particular music. You cannot always catch the tune of it. My grandson Bill also liked the Bible. He specialized in unpicking the book of Revelation. He said that was what it was like, the desert Kuwait, burning like the lake of fire. He who is not written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. I like stories that other people will tell you straight from the mouth, or the gob, as we used to say in Ireland. Easy-going tales, off the cuff, humorous, not the heavy-hearted tales of history. And I have had enough history for a lifetime, from my own life itself, not to mention the life of my employer, Mrs. Wolahan. That is an Irish name, of course, but as there is no W in the Irish language, I must suppose the letter was added in America many years ago in another generation. Because one thing I have noticed about words in America, they don't lie still, like the people themselves. Only the birds of America seem to stick, birds whose natures and colours so intrigued and confused me when first I came. Hereabouts, these days, the seaside sparrow, the clapper rail, the grackle, and the piping plover, and the 13 species of warbler that grace these shores. I myself have been about a bit, all told. The first town I hit was New Haven, 1,000 moons ago, as one might say, with my beloved Tig. Oh, that was a wild story enough, but I will try and write about it tomorrow. I am cold, even though the heat of early summer is adequate. I am cold because I cannot find my heart.